Welcome to Distinctive Christianity Podcast, where we compare Mormon and creedal Christian thought. Today we have the absolute honor of having with us the president and founder of Mormonism Research Ministry, Bill McKeever. Bill, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure, Skylar.
You've been doing this for so long. I honestly, it's been too long doing the podcast without having you on. I hope that our listeners, if they're not already familiar, you need to be familiar and you need to come visit the Christian Research Center. But what in your life led you into studying this over your lifetime?
That's a great question. I get asked that a lot because I don't have a background in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I was never a member. I never had a desire to be a member. It wasn't really until I was in high school that I even had, I would say, a meaningful relationship with people who were in the church. It's not that I didn't have a good friend who was a member of the church when I was younger, but we never talked about theology, didn't care. And he never tried to convert me. And these two girls that I had met in my journalism class in high school, they both wanted to make sure I knew they were LDS, but they never tried to convert me either. And I can understand because, in high school, I kind of hung around in a crowd. I played sports in my early years in high school. I was more involved in dirt bikes and motorcycle racing towards the end of my high school years, and I kind of hung around that crowd, and we were probably not the most sociable people, and maybe I wasn't really a candidate to be a Mormon because, it's all about goodness, and I wasn't really there. But after I left high school, and I did graduate, I went to Montana, and I worked at a sawmill in West Yellowstone. The sawmill's not there anymore, but I was a green chain operator, hated that job. It was terrible. One of the worst jobs I've ever had. And hard work, and it got cold up there in West Yellowstone. But I remember sitting down. This is a story that I really kind of started it all. I was sitting with a friend of mine who worked at the sawmill, and we were discussing religion, as professing atheists, I guess, at that time would do, we're the experts, even though I don't even believe there are true atheists. You have to be omniscient to really be a true atheist, in my opinion. But we were discussing things, and there was a lot of LDS influence in West Yellowstone because Rick's College, as it was known at that time, now it's BYU, Idaho, they would send in actors and actresses and put on these plays and stuff during the summertime in West Yellowstone. And they would kind of go down the streets with a horse-drawn wagon advertising these plays that they were going to have on. So they had a presence there. And I remember this friend of mine saying that the Mormon church was a cult. And I did not really even know what that was. And I tell people it had 4 letters. I figured it had to be bad. That's about all I know about this. See, my religious upbringing was really in my younger years. My father was Roman Catholic, though I never really knew my father. He died when I was 6 years old. And my mom had joined the Catholic Church in order to marry my father. So after my father died, my mom felt, I guess it was important to give us some religious upbringing, so she put us into catechism, okay? But you've got to understand at that time, it was all about social things and stories. It really wasn't about theology. So I never really understood a lot of that kind of stuff and didn't have a whole lot of room in my life for that kind of stuff. And so by the time 8th grade comes around, I really don't want anything to do with this anymore. So I didn't have a deep knowledge of theology at all. But when he said that, and I thought about it, and I'm wondering, well, wait a minute, I have friends that are a part of this organization, and they're nice people. They really are. And I say this to this day. They are super nice. I've often said their niceness sometimes gets in their way when it comes to recognizing their own innate sinfulness and such. But still, they are nice people. But, I'm thinking works here. Hey, nice people, they can't be bad, right? And so that's how the culture thinks when it comes to religion. And so when I went back to California, I ended up becoming a Christian. And I remembered what my friend had said. And so I wanted to look into this. And I got a hold of a book. There were a couple of books, but one of them primarily was Gordon Frazier's book. I think it's Mormonism Christian or something like that. but I really wanted to read it more for the footnotes. I'm really big into primary sources, and I've always been big into primary sources. And I love reading footnotes and endnotes. I spend lots of time, reading those. And I got that book, and there was I think it was in that book that it mentioned another guy, Art Budvarson, who happened to live in the next town from where I lived in Southern California. I was in El Cajon, and he lived in La Mesa. And I remember going to the local Christian bookstore asking if they had a copy of Arthur Budvarson's book on the Book of Mormon. And it had a couple of titles. I think it was once called The Book of Mormon Examined. It was reprinted, and I think that's when they changed it to The Book of Mormon True or False. Well, Katie Wood, who owned the bookstore at that time, looked it up in this big, huge volume. This is way before computers were popular. And she couldn't find it. And so she says, but he lives right in this city, because that's where the bookstore was, is in La Mesa. I says, really? He says, yeah, just look him up in the phone book. Phone book. Now I just lost half of my audience right here. The phone book. And so I did. And Arthur Budvarson, of course, right near the top. And I remember just calling the number and asking him, this is the Arthur Budvarson who wrote the book on the Book of Mormon. He says, yeah. So we ended up becoming fast friends. Now, I'm in my early 20s. And probably 20 about that time. And he at this time would have to be in his 70s. And he and his wife became very good friends with me and my wife. And we used to go to dinner together, and they had all sorts of interesting stories about growing up in Mormonism, because they started Utah Christian Tract Society in the 1950s. Wow. They were the ones who came out with those little white pamphlets with the blue ink on them, the staples in the back. Quite expensive to print, but they were very, very recognizable. And Art loved to talk about LDS history and things like that. And I learned a lot from them. Not having an LDS background, Art and Edna, his wife, taught me a lot about how Latter-day Saints think and things like that. So it was invaluable. Plus, he had this small library where he had all the biggies, the Journal of Discourses, and he would make photocopies for me. I mean, I was probably the worst pest you could ever imagine at that time, but Art was always very gracious and patient with me. And as I'm learning this, of course, other Christians are realizing, hey, if you're having missionaries come over, give Bill a call. He'll come over, and we do the usual setups. And I look back on that and go, I'd probably never do that now. But back then I was young and stupid. Now I'm just old and stupid. And so I would be there. And this is how I got to learn to talk to a lot of missionaries, because friends were inviting me over, and when they had missionaries over, and I'd just sit there, and then the subject would come up and I'd ask a question. And I enjoyed talking to these young people. And it was amazing, because you realize that a lot of these young missionaries and such, they're very zealous, and I give them credit for that. But as you can expect, they're not real knowledgeable about the history of their church, or even the theology of their church. And the things that they would deny that I was learning were patently LDS teachings was just fascinating to me. And this is what you notice when talking with a Latter-day Saint. Sometimes I use the expression, I know what they're supposed to believe, but I've learned from experience that not every Latter-day Saint believes what they're supposed to believe. And this is where it can be a little bit tricky sometimes in talking with Latter-day Saints. I've often said that one of the worst ways that you can come to learn about Mormonism is by asking your LDS friend. And I know that might sound terrible up front, but let me explain myself. See, the LDS Church has always kind of had this inferiority complex, and they always have wanted to be embraced by the Christian community, even though they think that we're a bunch of apostates. It's kind of a weird dichotomy.
They want to be embraced by the great and abominable church.
Exactly. Yeah. And so sometimes you find in talking with Latter-day Saints, they're going to show you a side of what they believe that they hope you don't have a problem embracing. So they don't always bring up the things that they know. See, this is where I think a little bit of dishonesty creeps into it, because they know if they bring this up, that's only going to invite questions from a person such as myself. And I'm going to ask some of these embarrassing questions. And a lot of Latter-day Saints are not ready for that. They don't want to do that. They just want to talk about the things we agree on. So asking your LDS neighbor, well, what is it that you believe as a Latter-day Saint, is probably going to get you an answer that's very maybe vague or somewhat deceptive, misleading, I should probably say. But they're not going to deal with a lot of the things that I think Christians over the decades that the church has been around have caused them to separate the church from being outside of the umbrella of Christianity. And this is why primary sources were always important to me. I want to know, what does the church want its people to believe? What are the things that are non-negotiable? We as Christians have non-negotiable subjects. They have non-negotiable subjects too. So what are they? What can be ignored or even denounced and still keep you in the church? That kind of stuff. And over the years, this has been a fascinating journey in talking with all sorts of different Latter-day Saints. Some who, if you ask, they don't have a problem telling you. Some, if you ask, they have a big problem telling you. And they'll sometimes be critical of their past leaders who have taught things that they don't agree with. Now, they don't have authority to do that. I mean, they can disagree, but they have no authority to say that that person's wrong, really, because that's just not how it works in Mormonism. There's this chain of command and authority structure that, let's say you as a lay member holding your Melchizedek priesthood, you're one of thousands and thousands and thousands, but there's only one who is the prophet, seer, and revelator of the entire church who speaks for the whole church. So you can't really correct them. You can disagree, but if you're going to disagree publicly, it's going to probably get you in trouble down the road if people start listening to you. So,
absolutely. And it can go the other way too, where they will lean into a past leader over current ones. And so this is a fight they will have where what do you describe as doctrine and opinion in the history of the leadership?
Well. You remember Ezra Taft Benson, the 13th president. He had that famous speech, the 14 Fundamentals and Following the Prophet. And a lot of people probably don't even remember when he first gave that. I think it was back in the 1980s. But then it was revised, it was brought back to the surface, not revised, because they had 270s talk about the same speech in General Conference. And they were going through it point by point as if Benson had no problems. And one of the things that Benson said in the 14 Fundamentals speech that he gave was that you don't pit a living prophet with a dead prophet. And of course, as a Christian, I'm wondering, why not? Why would there be a problem here? I mean, do we have a problem pitting Moses against Ezekiel or something like that? No, but they do, and the reason why they do is because these guys aren't always on the same page,
right?
And they will teach things that are not the same. And of course, if they're getting their information from the same source, you would think that source, described as Elohim or Heavenly Father, doesn't have a memory problem, and he's supposed to be consistent in what he teaches, you would think, but there isn't that consistency that we as Christians would hope to see with our LDS friends. And so this is really their problem. It's not ours. We're just bringing it out and explaining why we as New Testament Christians have a problem with this.
Right. I once brought up that Benson 14 Fundamentals to someone, and they said, well, he didn't give that as president, so.
It was, and they're right.
He was president of the 12.
Yeah, but the fact that it was brought up again in General Conference gives it that official status, because I don't know if many people remember, but it was Dieter F. Uchtdorf who, in an article in the Ensign, was talking about the importance of General Conference, in saying that General Conference, this is when God is speaking through his servants. So you take this seriously. I think Benson used the phrase that General Conference is like your marching orders for the next 6 months, because then you get another General Conference and you get more marching orders. So they take it seriously. And that's one of, I guess, if you want to go down this road, one of the reasons I have sometimes a problem with some of these authors that I read, where they kind of dismiss or water down the statements of some of these leaders as if it's not all that important. Well, they are important to those people.
Yep.
It may not be important to you as an outsider looking in, but they take this very seriously. So when I see comments like Gordon B. Hinckley or Bernard P. Brockbank and other leaders like that saying things like, we have a different Jesus, I kind of listen to that.
Right.
They're saying this. Mm-hmm. Why are we saying it's not when they're saying he is? He is different. Mm-hmm. Why do we all of a sudden dismiss those things? I listen very carefully to them. Now, they could be inconsistent when you take a lot of leaders together, perhaps. Okay, let's talk about that. But when they say things, I think as Christians, we need to pay attention to what they're saying. And this is why I place a much stronger emphasis on the general authorities in the church over, let's say, my LDS neighbor talking to me over the fence.
Right.
Because that neighbor has no authority to speak for the church.
Right, absolutely. And on that Jesus point, there is a continuity there. Hinckley was a lot nicer than what Brigham Young said.
Oh, yeah.
When he was describing our Christology and likening it to a mule. And in the Journal of Discourses, is people laughing, roaring. I mean, because it's a lot more charismatic back then.
Oh, yeah.
But, you could say, well, there's a continuity. And supposedly, because my neighbor's nice, we're not going to look there. But if we go back, so you're having these conversations with missionaries, you're clearly interacting with that public face, private reality that we often encounter. What drove you to consider this as what you're going to do full time?
Yeah, that's a great question, because if you had asked me in high school that I'd be doing what I've done for the past 45 plus years, I was, what? Why would I do that? But the way it kind of happened was because I was being asked by so many people to talk to them about what to expect when the missionaries come over and such. I was doing this so often, I thought, well, why not do something more in an official capacity? And again, this is where I had guidance from Art and Edna Budvarson. They were up in age, and they had talked about retiring for many, many years. And at a point, they actually asked me if I would take over their ministry, the Utah Christian Tract Society. And I was so intimidated just by being asked that. I didn't feel I was qualified to do that. I felt I was still learning. There was so much to learn. This is such a vast religion with so many nuances to it. And I really felt intimidated. So I kind of turned them down and said, I'm not quite ready for that. And that's fine, they said. So they kept going, and I kept studying. And then finally, a few years later, they had asked me again. And at this point, I thought, you know what? I think maybe I could do something like this. Maybe this would be good and kind of keep their legacy going. And when I said, I'm interested in that. Well, at this point, they weren't quite ready to retire. And that's fine. I understand that. I get it. I said, but can you help me? Because I really feel to do something more on this subject. And so Art was incredibly helpful. And he was the one that helped me incorporate Mormonism Research Ministry and helped us out with a lot of materials and stuff. And it's invaluable what they both did to get me launched in this type of work. And we started out very small. We had like 30 people on our mailing list, I often kid that I married an Italian, so we had instant family, instant mailing list, Yeah, but we came out with a little one-sheet newsletter, and I go back and I look at it and I go, oh my goodness, this is really amateurish. But printing back then was kind of amateurish too. Things have really changed even with printing,
Right.
And so we kind of learned, and I remember when we got our first computer, it was an Apple IIe with the 2 floppy drives, and I thought, what we've got, man. And then when I got my first IBM, compatible, it had like 40 megabytes. I'll never fill this up, And so we've come a long way. Of course, we didn't have the internet back then. We didn't have email. We didn't have anything like that. And so when that comes on the scene, that changes ministry like crazy. And it's been an incredible journey, and I've got to say this.
Right.
And I really, I look back at all the people that we were able to teach and minister to and share the gospel with. It's been very, very fulfilling.
Right.
I mean, I really, I got a few little regrets, but nothing major, of things I might have done a little differently, but that
Right.
otherwise great.
Right. When did you get out here and found formally Mormonism Research Ministry?
Well, it was formally formed in Southern California.
Okay.
Okay. And then what happened was around the time of the Olympics, we were planning on doing a big outreach. And so there was an organization up here among the local churches in the Salt Lake area. I think it was called the Utah Games Network or something like that. So I wanted to help out if I could. So I purposely came up here and sat in on some of their meetings on wondering how can we help. We've got an idea of what we want to do, but what do you guys want to do? We don't want to step on each other's toes. Let's help out. The Olympics is going to be a big deal. And so I came up, and it was interesting because I sat there, and I'm probably saying some things, and if some people remember this from years ago, I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings, but I sat there in these meetings listening to some of these people talk, and it immediately became apparent that guys like me were looked upon as some kind of pariah by some of the local pastors and such, as we're just rabble rousers, and we're just up here to shake the beehive and then walk away and leave the mess to them. And that was certainly not my intention at all. I saw this as a great opportunity of ministry. And so I remember there was one person speaking, and he opened it for questions, and I brought that up. I says, I came up here hopefully to help, and I feel like, my help is not wanted. And the pastor knew who I was, which was kind of surprised me. He knew me by name and mentioned he said, well, we're not talking about people like you, Bill. And I go, okay, that's comforting, But it ended up, what happened as a result of that is we had this kind of impromptu little meeting during lunch. And they wanted to know, well, what are you planning on doing? What do you want to do? And this is when we had the idea of using the handout, the little newspaper, very similar to what we had used for the opening of the San Diego Temple in 1993. That was an 8-page newspaper. This was much smaller, but it was just a little handout, said right on it, this is not LDS. But what we wanted to do with this newspaper was to point people to the sites down around Temple Square that we know that as tourists coming here for the Olympics, they're going to want to see these things. So why not have something that kind of gives them information up front of what to look for, and also talk about things that they're not going to hear from the tour guides.
Right.
Give them the other side of the story. That's what we wanted to do. And we had a number of these things printed up. We handed out tens of thousands of them during the Olympics. It was quite amazing. But I've always wanted to work with the churches. That's where you get the phrase, parachurch. We're going to work with them. We're not a church, but we want to work with the church and help the church and educate their people if we can. Have us come out. Let us help. And we've been doing that for years, is going to churches and speaking on this subject. We've had like symposiums that are like 4 hours long. We'll do whatever a church needs, really. Mm-hmm. And we have the means of doing it. And it's been great.
That's awesome. Well, especially with someone like yourself that's so well versed in the primary sources and have been for a long time, and are sensitive to the nuances, the context, the changes that we watch and what they emphasize, how they emphasize, what they stop emphasizing currently. It was hard to pick a topic, but I figured this one has been a theme on the podcast quite a bit, and I figured you'd be great to talk to kind of even sharpen our thinking further in some key areas. Just outline for the listener really quickly, I was trying to think of these patterns of how we separate history from folktale in Mormon claims of events. And it seems like there are some that start out historical and some that are not. Some that are historical but denied over time. Some that are start off historical, denied at the time but affirmed later, polygamy. Some that something happened but it becomes mythologized. And then there's just the non-historical, where things are remembered that aren't there, or things that are rewritten to have some event precede it for something happening at the time. And I know that's a lot, so we're gonna take examples of these and then kind of big picture summarize them, like what has happened here, so the listener can see the pattern. So it's not just the details. The details matter. In fact, without the details, the pattern is just, ethereal, right? Yeah. But at the same time, I want the listener to see you can do this if you're reading the primary sources and are sensitive to, how we can look at a source and be able to tell, when the first vision happened is something we're going to get to. So what if we started with the Smith family and magic? I remember a time when the seer stones were denied.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, I remember that.
Yeah.
Right.
Or at least not emphasized.
Not emphasized.
Kind of ignored.
Maybe you had it,
Yeah.
but the use of it was minimized.
Yeah, Joseph Fielding Smith, the 10th president, he denied outright that Smith used a seer stone. He had one, he admits that, but he didn't use it for the translation
Exactly.
purposes. Yeah,
that's the narrative.
Yeah.
To now it's publicly printed as a photo, and now it's an opportunity for further creativity theologically, right? It was a preparatory priesthood, I think Bushman called it. So take us through how pervasive magic was and if it was normal at the time.
Well, let me just cite something from one of the Gospel Topics essays that the church started coming out with in 2013. They came out incrementally, covering different subjects, many of which were controversial. And I do appreciate them coming out with the Gospel Topics essays. Yeah. I think that was a gift to us, because all we had to do now was point members to their own website.
Right.
And they could read it for themselves, things that we had been saying for years, But in one of the Gospel Topics essays, it admits that basically that Joseph Smith was involved in this seer stone and in this kind of magic, which was, I think what it says in there is something to the effect, which was quite normal at that time. So they were not denying it, but they were saying, well, this was common. Smith and his family was involved in this kind of folk magic, and it wasn't that big of a deal back then. That's not totally accurate, because Smith's involvement with folk magic, especially the money digging aspect, and was not something that set well with his future father-in-law, Isaac Hale. And speaking of the money digging thing, there's an outright dishonest statement in Joseph Smith's history where he says that when he was hired by Josiah Stoll to find a silver mine on his property, that's when he got the title of being a money digger. That's not true. The Joseph Smith Papers brings this out. Josiah Stoll wanted Joseph Smith because he already had the reputation of being a money digger. So that's a bit of mythology that probably should be corrected among the minds, in the minds of Latter-day Saints. Right. Isaac Hale did not like this. He did not like what Joseph Smith was involved in. And this became a real point of friction when, of course, Joseph falls in love with his daughter, Emma. And both Isaac Hale and his wife, they want no part of this guy. And so Smith promises, later on he's not going to do that anymore and things like that. And of course, that wasn't true. Smith made a lot of promises that he doesn't keep, it seems, especially, as you mentioned earlier, the subject of polygamy. I'm not doing that, or it's just this, or it's just that, trying to appease Emma, who never liked the subject of polygamy. But that's one thing. If, in fact, it was a common practice, is it a common practice for a person that's going to be a potential Latter-day Prophet, and he's still doing it after he is a Latter-day Prophet? It's not like he repents of it. because he doesn't seem to do that. So he's still involved with this folk magic kind of stuff, even when it comes to the translation of the Book of Mormon. And you're right. It's interesting about that seer stone, because you have all these people admitting it, some denying that he used it for translation purposes. But then you've got Russell M. Nelson, the president of the church back in the 1990s when he was an apostle, talking about the seer stone in the hat and the translation of the gold plates, as if that's no problem. I mean, he's practically reading David Whitmer's account from an address to all believers in Christ. And I think in doing that, the church can quite honestly say, well, we're not hiding it, because here he talks about it. Yeah, he's right. Whoever says that, they're right. He did. But when was the last time you heard about it? It's not like it's a story that's repeated on a local level so many times that it becomes a part of the conversation. How many members in the church today were around back in the 1990s when Nelson talks about this openly? Probably not very many, because the church has grown so much in recent years. So how many are really going to know about this? Now there's a movement going on, and it just is amazing to me. There's a movement among some Latter-day Saints to deny that Smith ever used a seer stone for the translation.
Whoa, that's
and I've watched some of these videos where they're getting around saying, well, yeah, I know Emma talks about it, but you know what? It was really people that were enemies of the church that were really talking about this. And I'm thinking, David Whitmer? Martin Harris? Emma? I don't think they were enemies of the church. Well, they would probably argue, well, yeah, but they were influenced by people who were enemies. That's a part of history I'm not familiar with, because this seems to be a part of their history. The church, what was it, in 2024, I think it was the March issue of the Liahona magazine, had an article on the seer stone celebrating the seer stone.
Yep.
So if this group is going to try to be taken seriously that he didn't use the seer stone, well, you're going against your church right now, because they seem to be behind that story. And their historians seem to be behind the story. Guys like Bushman, they kind of act like, yeah, it's kind of weird, okay? But, if that's the way it was, that's the way it was, kind of thing. But it is a part of their history, and there's no denying this. And so if a person in the church wants to deny it, again, that's their problem. Okay, that's not my problem. I'm going by what the church says now.
Right. If it was so normal, why was it illegal?
Yeah.
Right. And
yeah, it'd get you in trouble.
Right.
I mean, with the Bainbridge court trial with Joseph Smith, and of course the argument is well, yeah, but he was never really formally found guilty. Well, no, because the judge let him abscond because he was underage. He wasn't 21. That was the legal age back then, and he kind of let him go. So yeah, and there's all sorts of complications when it comes to that, but still, why would somebody be brought up on charges, as a glass looker at that time, if this was okay?
Right.
I think you raise a good point.
Right. And it seemed like one of the tactics was to say there was something in the past that he gave up, and maybe even tie it. We'll get to the first vision later on, but tie it to, well, he said he repented, and so maybe this is one of the sins. Try to also domesticate it in his life to early on.
Yeah.
But if that's involved in the translation of the Book of Mormon, I think some of the Book of Abraham, you can't divorce the magic and the magic worldview from things they need now, right? You can't just say
D.
back
Michael
then.
Quinn wrote a whole book on this.
Right.
He's since passed away. Even though he was excommunicated, he used the phrase that he's a DNA Mormon.
Yeah, monastic Mormon.
Yeah. Quinn was he was an interesting guy. I remember listening to him at a Sunstone symposium down in L.A. And of course, I was interested, and so Matt Slick and I had went to go hear him speak on that, and it was fascinating listening to him, and because he has no problem with this.
No.
He has no problem whatsoever with it, and And I think modern Latter-day Saints probably privately do cringe,
Yeah.
when they read some of this stuff, because it certainly doesn't set well with 21st century Latter-day Saints for the most part, I would think. But it definitely is a part of their history.
Right.
And so there's a lot I could say on that. But
Right. No, totally.
yeah.
Polygamy. So with the Smith family and magic, that's one that has been partially denied almost all the time, right? But now historically must be affirmed in the era of printing pictures of it.
Yes.
And just better historical records. I think
Yeah.
in some part, just the work of the Tanners and you just
Yeah. Well, you talk about the pictures, the photographs of the seer stone. Has that ever caused you to wonder why in a museum owned by the church, when you own the seer stone, you don't display the seer stone?
right
You have a photograph of the seer stone.
when you have it.
Yeah, and that always made me wonder why did they do that? Why don't they it's just a rock, for Pete's sake, It doesn't
Yeah.
really have any intrinsic value to it. Maybe sentimental value to a Latter-day Saint, but why not put it under a glass case and say, here's the rock?
Right.
I mean, we have a facsimile of it here that we show people what it looked like, and it looks like the photograph. But that always puzzled me why they don't have it on display.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's and they've kind of shot themselves in the foot in denying his use of it, when all the primary accounts of the translation process of the Book of Mormon, he is in a hat, right? I should have said that earlier for those who don't know who are listening.
Yeah.
Right. He's supposedly looking into this rock with a hat over his face.
Yeah,
and translating
he's holding the hat with the open end towards him, and he puts the rock in the hat, and then he puts his face down to the hat, to the brim of the hat, to exclude the light. That's how it's described in David Whitmer's account. It was to exclude the light, and in the darkness the spiritual light would shine, something resembling parchment would appear, and on it appeared the writing. Joseph Smith would read the characters off to his principal scribe, who was Oliver Cowdery, who was also his third cousin on his mother's side, and when Cowdery would read it back and it was correct, it would go on to the next set of characters. That's how David Whitmer describes this. If that's how it happened, there's no margin for error, it seems.
Right.
And because it's not going to go on to the next set of characters
Right.
until he reads it back correctly. So when you look at what was written down, that's the way it should have been. But yet we know that over the years, the church has seen fit to make a lot of alterations to the Book of Mormon, changing the text to where it changes the meaning. And you have to ask, and I've asked this of many Latter-day Saints, you would think if that's the way it was translated, the original that we find in the 1830, unless it was a printer error, okay, it should read correctly, but yet the church changes it. Okay, like the one famous one about Mary being the mother of God, and then they insert the Son of God.
Son of God.
That's not in the original. That's carried it above the line. That comes about later on. That phrase was not read to Oliver Cowdery, and Oliver Cowdery did not read that phrase back to Joseph Smith. We assume if he's telling the truth on how it was done, or Whitmer's account is accurate, I should say. So yeah, there's a lot of problems here, and why would you change the most correct book on earth?
Right.
So,
and what I want the listener to see,
I should say, Smith says,
as Smith said, right, and the keystone, right, the
keystone of our religion,
right?
Yeah, man could get nearer to God by following its precepts than any other book,
right?
Yep.
Exactly. So what I want the listener to hear is there are the facts, some of which were denied, partially denied, some totally, and then the range of interpretation on those, from negative, it's something he repented for, to this is a great opportunity, and like I literally heard Kwakuel say, yeah, astrology and John Dee's and Elkin magic is great too. So that range. But what's undeniable are the facts that he used the same seer stone he's using for treasure digging in the foundational texts of Mormonism, at least a lot of them. And so that's one where you have to get through that to what happened and to kind of separate interpretation from fact, and then see how in the case of us too, right, a faithful Christian would view those same facts. What about polygamy? This is an interesting one because there's another hiccup more recently on this where, Joseph Smith is denying it early on, to open proclamation, to partial denial, still kind of practice. So do you want to take us through this, and how we get at what happened?
Yeah. The polygamy issue is fascinating in and of itself. When you go back to what the early 1830s in the Fanny Alger affair.
Yeah.
I think is the way the Tanners describe it. Well, it was Oliver. Was it Oliver? Trying to think, was it Oliver Cowdery that called it a dirty, nasty, filthy affair?
Yeah.
And he claims he saw Joseph Smith rolling around in the hay with Fanny.
Yep.
And of course, you can understand why Emma is going to have a problem with this, And yet, Smith is, when it comes to polygamy, you cannot separate polygamy in Mormonism from prevarication. Just remember the two P's. There's got to be lies because he's going to cover it up. And he's going to try and weasel his way out of it. And sometimes he'll change what it really is in order to appease Emma. Oh, it's really more of a future thing, like here it's all platonic and there's nothing sexual about it. And of course, it sounds like Emma sometimes does believe him and she's willing to acquiesce, although I think she was probably smarter than that and is really doubting in the back of her head. It's like, trust but verify, Right. And then when she goes on that riverboat to go get supplies, and Smith ends up marrying the Lawrence, I think it was the Lawrence sisters or Partridge sisters, I get them mixed up. And then when she comes back, she's basically saying, okay, you can have plural wives, but I get to pick them, and I pick these, not knowing he's already married them while she was gone. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is so much intrigue. I mean, if they did a movie on this, it would be rated R. There's no way. I mean, Mormons couldn't even go watch it because it's rated R. No. And so there's a lot of deception. And this is where I get a little bit irritated sometimes when I listen to some of these BYU scholars and other apologists talk about the virtue of Joseph Smith. If there's one area to show that he was not virtuous, this is the area.
Absolutely.
I mean, what he did to Emma during that time period was just unconscionable. And I've often used the phrase, and if you listen to our radio show, Viewpoint on Mormonism, I've said many times, a man that will lie to his wife will lie to anybody. Take that to heart, folks. If he lied to Emma, he'll say things that you're probably believing that's a lie. So you want to be careful about this guy. He was not virtuous.
No.
And he's always covering his rear end. And so I feel bad for Emma at times, but then I read William Law's account of Emma, and he didn't like Emma either, Right. And William Law was a counselor to Joseph Smith at the end. And this is where you were talking about he vacillates to kind of admitting it and not admitting it and things like that. Well, when it comes to Joseph Smith's final days, he's outright denying it publicly and uses that phrase, people say I have more than one wife, but I only see one. I'm paraphrasing it. And of course, William Law knew better than that, even though he was not really part of that inner circle of other polygamists like Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball. He knew he heard the rumors, no doubt. And there were no doubt a lot of rumors going around in Nauvoo about what was going on with this issue of plural marriage. The problem for Joseph Smith is he got a guy like William Law ticked off at him, and that's who ends up coming out with the Nauvoo Expositor newspaper, and that starts the whole thing in motion when Smith has the printing press destroyed and the newspapers, as many as he could, destroyed. And what a mess that causes him. But again, right. Here's this deception,
Right. He says, what a thing it is to be accused of having 7 wives.
Yes, when I
can only find one. And he had, I've seen different numbers for at that moment, mm-hmm. but maybe around 20 wives at the time.
Well, yeah,
somewhere in that ballpark.
yeah.
I should have looked up the exact number.
Well,
Lindsay said that.
the church, what we're talking about here is right up towards the end of his life. Okay, we're getting right up there to what the King Follett Discourse, the Sermon in the Grove, and Smith is really going off the rails theologically, and William Law is, really upset about this. This is just not true. And Smith always doubles down. The issue of polygamy comes up. Smith, of course, is going to be denying it. And so if we are to listen to the Gospel Topics essay on polygamy in Nauvoo, the church itself, in a footnote, admits that Smith had as many as 30 to 40 wives. Now, at the Utah Christian Research Center, we have a big chart showing 33. We use Todd Compton's list because we found nobody really challenges the list that Todd Compton had in his book, In Sacred Loneliness. So we show photographs of these women, as many that there are photographs of them, and then little bios. And it's amazing when people look at that chart and they see, and our little bio shows polyandrous relationship, polyandrous marriage, meaning, of course, these women had living husbands. And you can imagine at that time period, okay, not only practicing polygamy, which is abhorrent to so many Christians, but saying it's okay to have a polyandrous relationship. You can't even point to the Bible to try and even support that. And I know they often support to the patriarchs and people like that having more than one wife. And of course, it doesn't always work out very well for them when they do that. Yeah. But still, you don't see anywhere where polyandry is okay.
No, I've seen one point to Levirate marriage. See, that violates our social norm as a gateway to accept. I think Compton and I said, oh man, 9 out of his first 11 or 12, it's in the book in Sacred Loneliness, were polyandrous. Yeah. And almost a transitionary period there. We should mention the teen brides.
Oh, yeah.
And what's crazy is that's not even including Fanny Alger, who the church needs to have be his first plural wife.
Right.
Well, then you add another teen bride to them, a 14-year-old, 17-year-old girls.
Yeah, Nancy Winchester. Yep. And I think they, and one of them, the one that married Whitney. I'm blanking on this right now. I can see her headstone because I know right where she's buried in Salt Lake Cemetery. It was Kimball's daughter, where it explains in the Gospel Topics essay she was, 3 months from turning 15?
Right.
Why don't you just say she was 14?
She was 14.
Why do you word it that way?
Right.
I think they word it that way because they have a problem with this, and they know readers are going to have a problem with this. Now, I appreciate their transparency up to this point, but just be totally honest. Let the chips fall where they may. Don't try to cloud it with that kind of language. And yet the church does that.
Right. Absolutely. So there's this recent movement to try to deny it happened.
Polygamy.
Yes, polygamy. With Joseph specifically. They would say it started with Brigham. And what they're doing is they're taking his public lies, assuming they're true, and then dismissing evidence otherwise, right? Is this what you're seeing?
Well, I know the arguments that are being raised by this group, but it doesn't really, in my estimation, take seriously the wives that were a part of this who admitted it, boldly admitted it, and were proud of it.
Right. I
mean, we have a lot of those plural wives of Joseph Smith buried here in Salt Lake. I mean, some of them are all over Utah. I've seen their graves. I've been there, but they admitted this, and they were proud about it. That they were married to the prophet.
Some of them saying in every way.
Married. Exactly.
I think Eliza Snow comes to mind.
Yeah. So I think it's difficult. I think even if I understand correctly, even the Community of Christ now, even though they don't like the polygamy part of their history, at least come to terms in knowing, it was there. It was there. When you've got some of these wives getting legal statements saying, yes, I was one of his plural wives, again, that's a primary source. Do we just ignore what they're saying? Are they lying? Give us evidence that they're lying.
And who are they telling to? They're telling to people Other LDS general authorities, I think, in Orson Pratt collected a lot of affidavits. Joseph F. Smith collected some of these affidavits because they were using against the Josephites. They were using against the polygamy denying Mormons,
Right.
and it was a sign of their apostasy that they gave up the practice.
Well, you know what I find fascinating about all this is before the Gospel Topics essay came out, it was not uncommon to find Latter-day Saints that denied Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. And if you brought it up, they would basically accuse you of being a liar. I know, because I've been accused of that by Latter-day Saints. They said, no, there's evidence to show that Smith also had plural wives. What's always strange to me is they had no problem admitting Brigham Young did. Why do you not have a problem? Why are you having a problem with Joseph Smith? And I remember I was with Eric Johnson, downtown. We were in front of the Christus statue talking to a couple of sister missionaries. And I had just been on the computer across Main Street in the Joseph Smith Memorial Building, calling up Joseph Smith's plural wives. I think I found 23 of them on that computer. And I had a sister missionary denying that he had more than one wife. And I had to explain to her, I was just on your church computer where it admits he has these wives. And she still didn't want to believe me.
Right.
This denial, and this does not help members of the church. And this is something that I've said for many years. It does not help your people when you deceive them regarding your history, because they are going to find out. Mm-hmm. And they're going to remember that you deceived them. Yep. When those essays started coming out, we were pretty pleased with that, because it gave us, as I say, a lot of street cred. Because we'd been saying this stuff for years. And all the things that many Latter-day Saints were being told were lies by those terrible antis. Now they're finding out the church is admitting it. It didn't make the church look good. It made us look good.
Right.
And I think it caused even more to come our way to want to know more about what we knew, and helping them because of the doubts that they were now having.
Right.
The essays we found that were meant to alleviate a lot of the doubts, I think actually worked to create more doubts with many members of the church. And I know of cases of people who have left because of those essays. Mm-hmm. I remember one couple telling Eric, that wasn't the church I signed up for, and now the church is admitting all this stuff. You can imagine how that doesn't sit very well when you thought you joined the only true church on the face of the earth and you found out that they were deceiving you.
Right, absolutely. And so much resting on the virtue of someone like Joseph Smith or the integrity of someone like Brigham Young. One thing, too, that this is in terms of the historical pattern, this is one. Joseph's denying while he's alive, publicly, privately practicing it. Brigham Young announces it publicly, I think through Orson Pratt.
Right, 1852.
Right. Yeah. So now it's the mark of the true church, right? Then you get to the manifestos.
1890.
Right. And then was it 1905 was the second?
1904 was the second manifesto.
Right, after the Reed Smoot hearings with President Joseph F. Smith. And then you have the third. Christina Rossetti has a really good recent book on Joseph Musser. Mm-hmm. And she says we always miss the Heber J. Grant third manifesto that we really, really mean at this time. Yeah. Although Heber J. Grant himself was a polygamist. But this is the first time they actually basically participate in persecuting their fellow Mormons. And then you have this case where it's there doctrinally, but they don't do it in one life, but it's still there. And this has created a weird sense of denial. We don't do it anymore. It's like, do you still believe it?
I think you're referring to what they call the celestial polygamy.
Yes,
where,
exactly.
Yes, we still believe it. It's still on the books. It's kind of hard to get rid of Section 132 in the Doctrine and Covenants. But we just don't practice it the way we did in the 19th century.
Right.
And this is where I think guys like Gordon B. Hinckley were being deceptive, acting like, hey, we have nothing to do with that anymore. no, you still do.
Exactly.
You just kind of tweaked it to where you kind of skirt under certainly civil law, but theologically, you still hold on to plural marriage because, well, Russell M. Nelson is sealed to two women.
Exactly.
You have Dallin Oaks, who's sealed to two women.
Mm-hmm.
They both believe that when they die and everything is all accounted for, they're going to have both of those women be their wives throughout eternity.
Exactly.
Now, that might not seem as offensive as practicing it here in this mortality, but it's still there. So quit telling us it's not a part of your theology. At least explain the change and how it's being practiced. But it's still there. And the sad part about that is I think it's Carolyn Pearson.
Mm-hmm.
I saw her and I heard her speak up at the U. And it was a packed house. And she was talking about her book, which was basically a compilation of a lot of the letters she has personally received from distraught, fearful Latter-day Saint women, knowing this doctrine is still a part of the church and wanting some kind of comfort because they're afraid, especially the younger ones, she said, if they were to die and they're still young enough where their husband could probably find another woman who hasn't been sealed to another man, because that's the catch. They can't be sealed to another man. But if they're not sealed to another man, their widower, could find one of these women and marry them in a temple, be sealed to them, and then she has to move over in the next life to another wife. Mm-hmm. And how many Latter-day Saint women were just so fearful of this. And that was really the gist of her book. And listening to the women get up to the microphone and talk about a lot of these things, it was heart-wrenching sitting there listening to this. I don't think that Ms. Pearson's antidote to this was reasonable, because basically she was calling on members to petition so much their leadership to get rid of this doctrine.
Right.
Well, at that time, you had 3 leaders in the church that had more than one wife. L. Tom Perry was alive at that time, so you had 3 of them. He's since passed away. And I'm thinking, there's no way they're going to change this doctrine. I mean, Nelson's right in the middle of it. And then you've got Dallin Oaks, who's next in line when Nelson passes away. If he outlives him, he's the next guy.
Right.
They're not going to get rid of this.
Right.
And how does that even work? I mean, all of a sudden, all the wives that Brigham Young had sealed to him, or Joseph Smith had to him, in the next life, now that these women don't have any husbands, what's going on now? How are they going to explain this?
Right.
They can't. What a mess.
In reducing, what are they now? Just concubines, though the term is used in D&C 132. It's there. Look it up. Yeah. But this is why even the sexual nature of the practice, you can see in, once again, that within the folklore about the history. He didn't have intercourse with any of the other wives. But the point in D&C 132 is seed. That's
Jacob 2 in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
Says polygamy is an abomination unless he wants to raise up seed. That is the only exception that's given in the Book of Mormon.
Exactly. And so even if they don't, once again, practice it simultaneously in this life currently, the idea is eternal procreation later. So that still has a sexual component even now. And so you're right. Christians need to get the nuance. But I've even seen some Christians saying we shouldn't ever talk about this. And I'm like, no, this is, there are topics more important. But on Mormon terms, I'm not sure there are many.
Yeah.
It is at the core of their who God is and who they are, who they wish to be, should they be worthy.
No doubt about that. And I think you're right. It's probably not a subject I'm going to bring up if I'm talking to a Mormon on the street and this is my first encounter. You're right. I have more important topics than this. But I think, for instance, with our LDS neighbor, who maybe we've had conversations with over time, it probably is not a bad topic to bring up and say, hey, I'm kind of confused about this. Maybe you can help me out as a member. Explain this to me, because here's the problem I'm having. One of the problems that I have with plural marriage like this is, how does a person, let's take Joseph Smith, for instance, who didn't live with a lot of these women and certainly did not really act as a husband as defined in the New Testament. He wasn't acting as a husband like that because he was never there, except maybe to bed them some night, you might say. But how does he behave like a husband should, a Christian husband, when he's not even around them, meeting their other needs, as well? You can't do that in a polygamous relationship. That suffers. And even Compton brings that out, how a lot of these women kind of, the title in sacred loneliness,
right?
It had its repercussions like that. So there's all sorts of problems with this. And I guess getting back to my real pet peeve is the church acts like they've washed their hands of this chapter. And no, the chapter is still there. It's still being read, and it's still going to play out. And yet they act like, well, because they don't do it like they did in the 19th century, it's okay.
Right.
I think they need to fess up to this and be honest about it. And I thought the Gospel Topics essay came close. Again, I appreciate the transparency, but there was even a limit to the transparency in those essays.
Right.
They could have done a lot more and made things a lot more clear, but they chose not to. But as I say, hey, it's their essay. They can say what they want.
Right, right. And to underscore something you brought up earlier, at the time Gordon B. Hinckley is making these dismissing statements to the public, he's presiding over a church in which, in their most sacred place, with their most holy priesthood, they are sealing men to more than one woman in eternity.
Yep.
So if that's not a lie, what other term do we use?
Yeah, and he's friends with them.
Yeah.
Yes. He knows these guys.
Absolutely. Well, maybe not Nelson so much, but maybe there was some tension with him.
Well,
Nelson,
yeah. But going back to that 1990 General Conference. Yeah, right.
Nelson seems to be trying to just outshine him everywhere he did. But how about this? Things that are mythologized over time. I know you've done so much work on Book of Mormon origins, the plates, things like this. Will you take our listeners through how you approach these sources and yet contest the accuracy and yet how the story takes on a life of its own apart from what happened?
Yeah, the gold plate story I've always found fascinating because I want to take the account as the church sets it forth. And we have to assume that a lot of what the church sets forth, they get from Joseph Smith. In other words, some of the things that they say regarding the details of how Smith gets the plates and all that comes obviously from his mother and her account in one of her books. That account finds its way into church manuals. Well, obviously that shows that they believed it. Now, where does Joseph Smith's mother get it? Obviously, she's getting it from him. She wasn't there, so she has to get it from another source, and we have to assume that it's Joseph Smith she's getting it from. And no one seems to deny this that I have found. And so when you have, for instance, Joseph Smith being told about these gold plates that contain a record of ancient inhabitants and the source from whence they sprang, and the angel himself says that they are written on gold plates, not tembaga plates, not alloy plates, not plates made of ziff. Gee, that
right.
The angel said they were made of gold. He was the last one to handle them. All right. He was the one who buried them when he was a human being centuries earlier, so I would think he would know. And so Joseph Smith finally is allowed to go retrieve the plates after 4 years. He takes them out of the stone box and puts them in a hollow log. I have no idea why he does that. I really don't. It kind of throws me off. But then he goes back later on and he walks to go get the plates. First time he goes with Emma, he's in a wagon when he moves them from the stone box to the hollow log. At least he has some kind of transportation where he could put these plates if he were to take them home at that time, but he doesn't. Next time when he goes back, he's walking. He's got a 3-mile walk. That's what his mother said. The home was 3 miles away from where they were deposited. And of course, he's going to take them home, carrying them under his arm, he said. He tucked them under his arm, wrapped them in a linen frock or a linen shirt, as one account says. And then he heads for home. He wants to get off of the well-traveled road, goes onto a path, and of course this is where he's attacked by 3 separate attackers. It gets into fights with these guys, is able to knock them down and be able to get away from them. His mother said at one point that he ran for a distance of half a mile, which is 2 laps around a football field. I like to say that to people just so they can visualize this is how far he's running. A half a mile is a long way. He's carrying these plates. And of course, when we start to look at some of the things that Joseph Smith said about these plates, the story, in my estimation, certainly unravels very quickly. Smith made the mistake of telling us the size of the plates, 6 inches by 8 inches by 6 inches deep. The fact that they're made of gold, nobody argues that those plates, if they were made of gold, as the angel claimed, those plates would have weighed around 200 pounds. And when I say that, LDS apologists have scoffed at me, on their little podcasts. Oh, gosh, Bill says that they weigh 200 pounds. I said, no, I'm going by how much gold would have weighed in that size that Smith gives us. And there's no denying that. Even church leaders have admitted that. If it was made of gold this size, they probably would have weighed about that. But, of course, they make all sorts of excuses like air gaps in between the plates and all that kind of stuff. And then they throw in the alloy, the Tobaga theory, which goes back to an article in the Improvement Era back in the 1960s by Reed Putnam. Okay, fine. But I'm telling you, even if you use the Tobaga theory and you put a 50% air gap, as he says, think about it, a 50% air gap, Schuyler. That means the top 2 inches that Joseph Smith supposedly translated now becomes 1 inch of plates. The first edition of the Book of Mormon was 1 1/4 inches thick of paper. And we're going to believe that he was able to have these engravings give us a book as thick as the Book of Mormon on metal plates. The story even becomes more fantastic when they go in that direction. They solve one problem, they think, and they only create another problem.
Right.
So it doesn't work, and I'm seeing all this. But the fact that the plates being as heavy as they were, even if you want to say they're 50, go ahead, knock yourself out. In fact, I'll challenge any Latter-day Saint out there that you've been saying that I don't know what I'm talking about. Come down to the Utah Christian Research Center and look at our display. We have the old lead plates that Sandra had in her bookstore that weigh 118 pounds. They're made of lead. We have them on display. My 80-pound plates that I used to take down to Manti for many years, I have those on display. And if you want to believe the Tobaga theory, I even have a set of plates for you. I have a 50-pound set of plates. Let's go do this. Let's put it to the test. Let's go out to any football field and let's recreate the story. And you can get any linebacker you want from BYU or the U. I don't care. Just let me film it. And we're going to see if this story can be recreated. And that's one thing I notice these guys, these critics, have never done. They just sit there behind their microphone taking pot shots.
Right.
I'm putting up a scientific experiment here. It's one that we can observe and repeat. And every person that comes to our center and picks up those plates, they all say the same thing. There's no way that they could replicate this. So what comes up? Well, Bill, you don't believe in miracles. And I go, yes, I do. It's just there's no miracle in this story.
Right.
The problem for the Latter-day Saint is you have too many leaders, like John Witso, who you mentioned earlier, who in one of his booklets said that the plates probably weighed about 117 pounds, an easy weight for someone like Joseph Smith to carry. Why would John Witso try to get it down to an easy weight that someone could carry? Because he doesn't believe there's a miracle involved in this story.
Right.
They don't use that argument. I've never heard Mormon apologists use that story. I've never heard any LDS leaders use the story that there was a miracle that enabled Joseph Smith to carry these heavy plates. I don't hear that. They're all trying to get the plates down to a manageable level. Reed Putnam does that in his Improvement Era article, and that's like the go-to guy that a lot of these scholars go to. Why are they doing that? Because they don't believe there was a miracle involved in this. Again, I'm just sticking with the primary sources here.
Right, absolutely. So if there was an incident that happened here, you can see that maybe early on the mythology started of what is this what's the purpose of this story, right? The importance of the plates, although he's not going to use them to translate the importance
That's
of
another problem.
Smith's calling,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, but because we see how unlikely it is that someone would actually have this story, we have a high degree of skepticism toward it, right?
Yeah, and I'm just sticking to the story as it's written. And I
Mhm.
found when I took my plates out to the Mormon Miracle Pageant for those many years, it became readily apparent when I'm kind of walking them through the story and refreshing their memory on all this, because I'd always ask, do you believe Joseph Smith had gold plates? They would all say yes. Do you believe the plates were made of the metal gold? I would say probably 99.9 would say yes. Okay. And now you've agreed with me. Now let's walk through this. It wouldn't be long before they would start changing the story.
Yep.
Well, maybe the plates weren't solid gold, made of, just gold. Well, wait a minute. That's what the angel said. So you're saying that the angel got it wrong, and he was the last to hold the plates. In fact, Mormon, his father, kind of put these things together. You would think he knew what they were made out of, and he was the last to write on them as well. So he got it wrong. Well, they're not about to say that. Okay, but you see, they have to get away from what the narrative actually says. And I remind them of this. I say, I want you to notice what you're doing. I'm sticking to the story as your church tells the story. You obviously don't believe the story the way the church tells it because you are making up details that are not in the story.
Mm-hmm.
At least give me credit that I'm trying to be true to what your church is saying.
Right.
If I came to you and I just started throwing out all my theories, you wouldn't take me seriously. And one time I asked a guy, so how seriously do you think I'm taking you right now?
Right.
Because you're not sticking to the narrative.
Right.
It's because you don't believe it either,
Right.
which is good.
Yeah.
Okay. You shouldn't. I think
Right.
this story's bogus, especially when Joseph Smith is able to knock down 3 separate attackers. And I often tell people, one time I'll give it to you. Maybe he got lucky. Maybe he took a swing with his left arm, right arm. I don't know. I don't care. And the guy fell down, maybe hit his head on a rock and was knocked unconscious for a while. And Smith was able to scamper away with his limp that he had ever since he was a young boy and had surgery. But twice, now this is starting to look suspicious. 3 times, you're making it up.
Right.
There's no way.
Right. And even Quinn, if I recall correctly in his Mormonism Magic worldview, he's trying to see like occult meanings in the 3, right? There's the 3 nights, there's the 3 this, the 3 that.
Yeah.
So it becomes this kind of Kabbalistic
Well, that's
occult
Quinn.
story.
I mean,
right.
that's where he comes from.
Perhaps he is right that this is the kind of thing Smith would do.
Yeah.
All the more reason to be skeptical when he's trying to place it in time and it doesn't fit with what someone can do in space and in time.
Yeah.
One that was particularly devastating, let's say, to me, as someone who was a loyal Brighamite, and I was not ashamed of that terminology at one point, was I had always heard as a kid and never questioned this story of the transfiguration of Brigham Young as something that made him stand out in the succession crisis. Will you take the listener through that and, if it happened?
The story goes that this is following the assassination of Joseph Smith. And naturally, Joseph Smith, being as young as he was, he died at the age of 38. He doesn't have a plan for succession. And I don't think he really planned on dying at the age of 38. I know he said, I go as a lamb led to the slaughter when he was going to Carthage. And of course, many Latter-day Saints believe he really said that. I tend to question a lot of the things that are attributed to Joseph Smith. And in those latter time and in the last part of their history there when he was alive. But I don't think he really felt he was going as a lamb led to the slaughter by the mere fact that he took a gun from John Fulmer and took a gun from Cyrus Wheelock and used one of those guns when the mob attacked the jail. If he really knew he was going as a lamb led to the slaughter, normally those animals don't fight back,
Yeah, right.
So definitely he's putting up a fight. And I know some Latter-day Saints will say, yeah, but do you blame him? I mean, this is illegal, the mob. And I go, well, yeah, but it's kind of illegal to have a gun in a jail too. So, I mean, it kind of goes both ways. I don't really take a firm position on that as far as should Smith have had the opportunity to defend himself because of this illegal mob that's attacking the jail? That's a fair question. But the fact remains, Smith is dead now, and there's no plan for a successor. At least there's no mechanics to be put into motion here. And so there is a power struggle between Sidney Rigdon and Brigham Young. Sidney Rigdon has been with this movement almost from the very beginning, and he's very close to Joseph Smith. Now, Sidney Rigdon did have a problem with saying things he probably shouldn't that got people into trouble, and he would speak off the top of his head, and obviously it didn't go very well for the Saints, sometimes because of some of the things that he said. But the fact remains, Brigham Young there was a film put out. I think it was 6 Days in August, I think was the name of it, or 8 days, 6 days. And they kind of bring this out. Brigham Young was not there when Joseph Smith was killed. He was on a mission on the East Coast. And so he comes back, and the film actually gives the impression that Brigham Young didn't care who became the leader of the church, but basically he did not want it to be Sidney Rigdon. And Sidney Rigdon, of course, wants to be the head of the church. And so there's this kind of like this oratorical showdown here where Rigdon's going to give his points and then Brigham Young's going to give his points and let the people decide. And the way it's brought out is Rigdon speaks and then Brigham Young starts to speak. And the folklore behind this is as Brigham Young was speaking, people said they heard the voice of Joseph coming out of Brigham Young. And some even would say that they saw Joseph speaking through Brigham Young, his actual features. And now Sidney Rigdon later on writes a letter to Brigham Young saying, that's a lie and you know it. And apparently it sounds like from what Rigdon understands, this is all after the fact. Even though the film that just came out not too terribly long ago makes it sound like this is what was kind of conclusive at the time it happens. There's a character who's blind who hears the voice of Joseph Smith. Of course, he doesn't see, but he hears. And so this is a story you're supposed to take away from it. It ends up where Sidney Rigdon is not chosen to be the successor. And so he kind of walks off into the sunset, ends up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, starts a splinter group there, and we really don't hear much of Sidney Rigdon anymore. But it's Brigham Young who takes over. And, you bring up, did this really happen? Well, I wasn't there. I don't know. I can only go by the records that are there. And I do know how sometimes people emotionally can think of things happening not quite the way they happen. And then as they talk about it later on down the road, the story gets embellished, kind of like the first vision account with Joseph Smith. It starts off just being Jesus appearing to him, telling him his sins are forgiven, and then it's angels appear, and then eventually in the 1838 account, it's God the Father and Jesus appearing. So this story gets changed as the years go by. And sometimes that does happen, especially when people are thinking about things in the past. If they haven't thought about it for a while, perhaps they're going to think of it a way it didn't really happen. That's just human nature, unfortunately. But a lot of people, if they're going to think that happened, that certainly gives credence to Brigham Young taking over as the president. Now, what I found fascinating in watching the film was the people putting this film out, they're owning Brigham Young.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. They are owning Brigham Young by including that transfiguration scene in the film. And now I'm thinking, okay, if you're going to own Brigham Young here, are you going to own him everywhere else?
Michael God.
Yeah. And, that's a biggie. Blood atonement and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, this is where a lot of the scholars get very squeamish. And they don't want to embrace Brigham Young for a lot of these things. Or they'll say, well, it was right for that time, but not right for later on. And I'm thinking, how does the attributes of God change?
Mm-hmm. Like who the Father is.
Yeah. But this is just one of those things where the church, I think, probably should do a better job. And I don't know, maybe even though they didn't produce that film that I'm referring to, if they are putting their weight behind it, then I'm going to have to say they are owning Brigham Young as well. But at least the producers of the film seem to be.
Right.
But
The one thing that struck me too is, as I recall, Orson Hyde telling the story of hearing Joseph, and it turns out he was not there.
Yeah, he wasn't there. From what I understand, he got there a few days later.
Right.
And that's not, see, again, that is not unusual sometimes when you read Mormon history. I remember it was Mark Peterson who did a book on Adam. And he makes a comment in the book about Charles Rich, who was there to hear this, this sermon. And then when they realized Charles Rich wasn't there, they reprinted the book, and instead of taking it out, messing up the pagination, they just said, Charles Rich, who wasn't there. Now it makes no sense whatsoever, so why is he even mentioned, I mean, this is not totally uncommon when you read some things in LDS history.
Right, absolutely. And so we can say he spoke, we can say he convinced many, but
Yes.
We're not convinced that he sounded and looked like Joseph Smith.
Yeah. Of course, again, I wasn't there, but I think you're right. The way one person, I can't remember who I was reading, that said something like this. What happened is Brigham Young bested Sidney Rigdon.
Yeah.
Let's just leave it at that. And I can leave it at that. That I agree. Brigham Young did best Sidney Rigdon, and Rigdon realized this isn't going to work, and I'm leaving.
Yeah, and he must have been charismatic for people to take the harder road of walking across the West to come. So clearly they saw something, but you can see them it almost betrays an anxiety over the authority issue of how he can. I mean, a ton of rabbit trails here. The first presidency, the patriarch, all that, but they need something to make him stand out, obviously.
Well, one thing that isn't brought out in the film that I don't know if a lot of Latter-day Saints are familiar enough with their history, it doesn't really bring out in the film how all of these players are polygamous.
Yeah.
They're all practicing polygamy. Brigham Young has more than one wife, and I think it does bring out one part where Joseph's talking to Emma about polygamy. But the fact is, all these guys were polygamous. They're not about to let Sidney Rigdon become the next president because Rigdon doesn't like polygamy.
Right.
He's more in the camp with Emma.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to sit well with these guys. Because you imagine if Sidney Rigdon became the next president, one of the first things he's going to do is the old executive order, and this is all undone now,
Right.
and we're not going to do this anymore.
Right.
That's not going to set well with Brigham Young or he or C. Kimball or any of the other guys that are already involved in this. So you can see why Rigdon was not a choice as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
Now, what about the people? They don't know what's going on because a lot of this is still being denied. And as you mentioned, it doesn't get announced publicly until 1852 when the Saints are already in Salt Lake Valley. So it's going to be a period of time before all that even comes out and it becomes public knowledge that the church is going to stand behind for its membership.
Yeah, much more messy.
Mm-hmm.
And the longtime listeners will know we've covered the succession crisis pretty consistently. We had Bradley Campbell, Mormonism Research Ministry, God Loves Mormons, on the Patriarch, fantastic video he made. And then
yes.
way back in the archives, we have Kyle Bashir's talking about the Strangites, who we didn't even include in this 500-foot level analysis of what was going on, at least between the two major players. But Strang has his own thing as well, and his own claims to angelic ordination and such. Here's one where I know you've done a lot of work, because the church, and it sounds like still are, emphasize this as kind of their founding story, and that's the first vision. That, at least in the official account, 1838, occurred in the spring of 1820. Take us through that and how we look at these sources, figure out if anything happened, what happened.
Well, the first account that we have of anything like the first vision is Joseph Smith's diary, his journal, where he claims in 1832 that he was concerned about the forgiveness of his sins. And because of his concern, he decides to go out into some nearby woods and to pray about the matter. And this is where he has this visitation, but we know who visits him, according to his account, and that is the Lord, who this personage said was crucified for him, assures him of his forgiveness. And what's interesting is he also mentions in this account that he already knew that all the churches were wrong by reading the Bible. That's not something he says in 1838.
Right.
So there is a contradiction there, because a lot of historians in the LDS Church try to say that you can harmonize all these various accounts. And there's about 4 accounts that Joseph Smith gives of his own. And there's a lot of other people who give accounts and get the details skewed, including Brigham Young, and including Wilford Woodruff and others. But still, when you have the main character getting the story mixed up, that's when question marks start appearing. But one of the things that is foundational in this whole story, and they always start off with this whenever they tell the story, it was in the spring of 1820 when Joseph Smith, according to the official account, was concerned regarding which church is true. Not so much whether or not he's forgiven. Now, they've conflated those two stories now. If you go watch the film downtown in the History Museum, and you watch that little film, it'll say that he was concerned about his sins and which church was true. So they've conflated his 1832 account with the 1838 account. But in the 1838 account, he doesn't mention any concern about his sins. He's more concerned about which church is true. And he spends a lot of time detailing why. And he said that there was a revival, a religious excitement, he calls it, on the subject of religion. This excitement on the subject of religion takes place in the Palmyra area where he's living at that time with his family. He's just a young boy. And what happens is, apparently there's a lot of disagreements as to which church is true. And it's interesting when you read some of the facts behind the scenes, because the account that Joseph Smith gives, it sounds like he's reading his Bible and he comes across James 1:5. Let any of you, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. And he uses this as his text to go out into the woods to find out, not wisdom, but knowledge. So he's misusing the verse is what he's doing. But what's fascinating is, you know where he gets that James 1:5? He's not just reading it one day in his devotions. No, George Lane, the Methodist minister, who even LDS leaders admit was part of this revival that was going on, who, by the way, was not in the Palmyra area in 1820, but he is there in 1824. It was George Lane who gave a sermon on this about wisdom and making a decision as to where you're going to go to church. Lane gave a sermon on this. Now, whether Smith was there to hear that or not, I don't know. But he probably heard about it, you would think, that, hey, you should have heard this sermon that, Reverend Lane gave, and it was on James 1:5. Well, he uses James 1:5 as his verse, which is interesting. How does he know that verse is translated correctly? Because whatever test you can use to know James 1:5 is translated correctly, you can probably use that same test on every other verse in the Bible.
Right.
That's just an aside. But the fact is, there is no revival in the spring of 1820. And Wes Walters did some excellent research on this, and we're really indebted to what Wes Walters did. He's passed away since. But he put together this little booklet. Originally, it was called New Light on Mormon Origins. Well, I had the pleasure of meeting his widow, Helen, and she ended up giving us, as a ministry, permission to reprint Wes's booklet. And so we do. We have copies of it at the center. And it's amazing what he brings out to show that this whole premise of the spring of 1820 is a lie. It's just a fabrication. And there was no revival in 1820. In fact, the records of the churches that were involved in this religious excitement that Smith describes, we know how many converts they had in 1820. And I think it was the Baptist, I think, gained 5, the Methodists lost 5, and the Presbyterians had no increase or decrease or anything like that. Hardly the great multitudes that Joseph Smith describes in his testimony in the Pearl of Great Price. So he gets this wrong. And some might say, well, is it really all that important? And I say, yes, I think it's incredibly important, because if the church were to be honest on this subject and say, you're right, it wasn't the spring of 1820, but the evidence seems to point to the fall of 1824. And that's when it really happened. It started with the Methodists, that's true, earlier, but then eventually the Baptists and the Presbyterians got involved in this later on in the year. And around the fall of 1824, this thing is really kicking off, and it goes into 1825. And we have accounts from, for instance, George Lane talking about the revival, and it matches to what he's saying, seems to match what Joseph Smith is describing. And he's writing this at the time it is happening, which is 1824. And he was one of the major players. Another major player was the Presbyterian pastor, that was Benjamin Stockton. And Stockton also was not in the Palmyra area in 1820. Neither of these two were there in 1820. So if the Smith family recognizes that these two men were there, and other LDS leaders admit that these two men were there, well, if they weren't there in 1820 and they were there for this revival, then when was the revival? Well, it seems to point to 1824. And you say again, why is that important? If the revival Smith is describing took place in 1824, that means Moroni shows up in 1823 to talk about the gold plates. He becomes the first vision. Mm-hmm. The church is not going to do that. They are not going to revise all of their manuals and go back and edit all their conference messages. They're not about to do that. And I don't think they're going to admit, yeah, we've been deceptive. I won't even buy they made a mistake. No, they've been deceptive. This information has been out for decades. Yep. And they know it's out there, but they ignore it. And so this is why when Eric and I did a series on the using the first vision as a witnessing tool in order to bring people to the true church, I have to chuckle. You're using a lie to bring people to the true church. The flags not go up when you hear something like that. See, I have a real difficulty with that. But the fact is, the revival that Smith is describing did not take place in the spring of 1820. It was the fall of 1824. That can be verified. It's not even that difficult. But yet the church still insists on using this erroneous date because it has to fit correctly in Smith's timeline. Smith just had a bad memory, I guess. I don't know. But the whole fact that he has to throw in God the Father tells me he wants to be seen as even experiencing something greater than what anybody else has ever experienced, because you don't hear of people talking about having visions of God the Father. And there's a reason for that. The Bible makes it clear in Exodus 33:20 that no man can see God and live. And what's fascinating is when Joseph Smith starts the church in 1830, one of the first things he's told to do is God wants him to give us a new translation of the scriptures. And so he begins working on it in 1830 and he finishes it. He says, "We this day finished our translation of the scriptures," and that was July 2nd, 1833. So in 3 years, he comes up with a new translation of the scriptures. And we should mention, it's not really a translation at all. It's kind of a translation, kind of like the Book of Mormon, where he just writes anything down. Bruce McConkie, who was a Mormon apostle, he said that Joseph Smith merely opened a King James Bible and just started making alterations wherever he saw fit, inserts of prophecy concerning his own birth in Genesis chapter 50, changes all sorts of verses, and there's no manuscripts to support his alterations. We don't see anything in the Greek or Hebrew that would substantiate some of the things that he was saying. But what's fascinating, and one of the reasons why I like using the Joseph Smith translation when I'm talking with Latter-day Saints, is he doesn't seem to touch the verses I'm going to use. He leaves them intact. The Isaiah passages that speak of only one God, he leaves them alone. Maybe puts an S on the word besides, or takes the S off. I can't remember. Titus 3:5, Ephesians 2:8 and 9, Galatians 1:8 and 9. All those verses read virtually the same. And these are the verses that I want to zero in on when I'm talking with a Latter-day Saint, because I have some real questions about these verses and how they view their theology. So we do see some serious inconsistencies here. But when we get back to the Exodus 33:20, in the Joseph Smith translation, it still says no one's going to see the face of God and live. But Joseph Smith adds a bunch of words to it. And we have a sign at the center which shows the quote in its entirety, where it basically says God is telling Moses that no sinful man at this time, nor will any sinful man at any time, see my face and live. And then what's fascinating is in Joseph Smith's account, he goes right into, after this, how he was involved in doing all sorts of stupid things. You know, he's admitting that he was sinful, though he kind of says, I wasn't bad, I wasn't all that bad, but still he's admitting he's doing behaviors that are really not conducive to a professing Christian, I guess you could walk away saying. So he falls under that category. He's a sinful person who should not be seeing the face of God and live. Now, it sounds like a contradiction, but it's really not, and this can be confusing. The reason why it's not really a contradiction is because Joseph Smith was not telling anybody at that time that he had seen the face of God. He was not inserting God the Father into that narrative. Nobody knew that. Joseph Smith isn't saying it. His parents don't know about it. His close confidants don't know anything about this story, because that doesn't get thrown into the mix until he writes down his 1838 account. And even that account takes a little while before it starts to get out among the masses when it's published in the Times and Seasons newspaper. So nobody knows this. So he's not really contradicting anything. He's just not telling the whole story at this time, because that insertion of God the Father doesn't come about for another 5 years. It makes you wonder, should Joseph Smith have read his own Bible version? Maybe he got a little more familiar with some of the things that he did, and then he would know, maybe that's not a good story to tell because I've already kind of made sure that can't happen. But apparently he doesn't.
Right.
So
it's in one of the things that I think is, I guess, like you said, there's a continuity in the apostasy narrative, you could say. Now, how he came to that realization is different. But the discontinuity matches other sources we have at the time, right? So the 1832 matches more closely with the view of God in the Book of Mormon, early strata, the D&C. The middle one matches more with the lectures on faith. And then in 1838, that's when you're starting to see the development of things that are going to lead to King Follett, Sermon in the Grove. And I think to me, that's what's so devastating about the development. It's not so much there just happens to be differences. It's that what is similar matches the context of the time of his developing theology, that the story is matching the theology that he's developing.
And leaders like Gordon B. Hinckley have made it very clear that everything about Mormonism, everything that develops later on after the church starts, can all be traced back to that first vision. Now, sometimes when he makes these comparisons, I don't know how he's doing that. Like he's saying, well, if this is true, then this is true. And I would say not necessarily. However, he makes an interesting comment. In one of his messages, he says that if the Father and the Son did not speak to Joseph Smith, the church isn't true, and we are engaged in blasphemy. Now, I like to emphasize that word. He doesn't say we got it a little wrong, okay, or we're off a little bit. No, he says we are engaged in blasphemy. This goes back to people who insist, even Latter-day Saints, who insist our view of Jesus is no different than their view of Jesus. Why would Hinckley say that? If he did not see the Father and the Son, we are engaged in blasphemy. Obviously, Hinckley knew that there was a significant difference in how Joseph Smith tells this story and how we interpret it as leaders in the church, that it's so different that we're not even on the same page with our quote-unquote Christian counterparts. Why is that never taken into consideration by many well-meaning people who want to insist that their Jesus is the same as our Jesus? I mean, Hinckley's saying this.
Right.
I didn't say it. He said it.
Right.
And I think the significance of that word should not be ignored.
Absolutely. And Hinckley being the ambassador of acceptance, right? Like this, we're not picking the harshest things they're saying. We're taking the softest things they're saying, and he still is acknowledging a difference between the traditional Christ that you and I believe in and the Christ they do. Just for people now, Hinckley kind of inaugurating the cult of niceness to the nth degree, in my opinion, and it's decaying into we agree. But then why the first vision being significant, even its 1838 form?
Yeah, because what do we learn from that encounter? What's the message that every Latter-day Saint takes away from that encounter? It's not so much that they believe God is a body of flesh and bones, because Joseph Smith never said he touched the figures.
Sure.
Okay. What they take away is all the churches are wrong.
Yep.
Their creeds are an abomination, and their professors are corrupt.
Yep.
That's what most Latter-day Saints take away. And, of course, that leads to the teaching that, of course, is found in Section 1 of the Doctrine and Covenants, that God is only pleased with the church that Joseph Smith was to restore, which means if it's the only true church on the face of the earth, then that means every other professing Christian church outside of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is obviously false. I don't know why a lot of Christians don't see the significance in that either. I mean, this is a position that the church has had since the very beginning, and they've not backed off on it.
No.
And every time they emphasize the first vision, that's a part of the package. You can't ignore that. That's a part of the package. That is, in their estimation, that is God's approval on what they are doing, as opposed to his disapproval of what we are doing, because we are a part of this great apostasy. We are teaching false doctrines.
Right.
And even though we're sincere, we're sincerely wrong. Okay, that kind of a position.
Right, absolutely. So this, man, such credit to Wes Walters for actually going and looking.
Oh, yes.
I mean, because right when Joseph tries to put it in space and time, we can test it, and all of a sudden it makes sense too. And this is something you've pointed out as well on on Viewpoint on Mormonism. Is the earliest stories of the church's founding centered on Moroni. I think Brigham Young, George Buchanan, you point out that they aren't even trying to put the first vision as the founding. They're trying to say it's Moroni in the Book of Mormon. Then over time, they, like Joseph was probably trying to do in 1838, I'll let Grant Palmer's point that he's in disputes over a lot of the 12 leaving, Oliver Cowdery, with something we're going to get to here in a second on priesthood restoration. They set themselves apart for an earlier controversy. Now he needs to set himself apart from Oliver Cowdery. So he needs something earlier than the priesthood restoration.
Yeah.
So he puts it earlier, spring of 1820, but that doesn't catch on. But it does, and they start centering their entire theology of who God is and who the true church is, with authority to do the ordinances necessary for salvation and exaltations. And now we can see the differing accounts. We can see the development. We can see that he didn't even use it. We can see the early not even using it.
You know, one of the best pieces of evidence to prove that God the Father showing up was not a part of the narrative is by the critical works against Mormonism in the early years. And there were several who were writing about Joseph Smith and the organization that he founded, and a lot of the claims that he was making for himself. And it's fascinating when you look at some of these earlier accounts, like Mormonism Unveiled and books like that. These are written in the early 1830s. They don't mention the first vision.
Yeah.
Now, I cannot imagine that they would overlook that and not talk about it if they knew that was a part of the story. But the reason why they don't talk about it, and the reason why they start with the angel Moroni, is because nobody knew about God the Father showing up.
Right.
That's a later invention of Mormonism. And I wish more Latter-day Saints would see this.
Yeah.
If anything else, you would think the critics would have latched on to this. The Campbellites, for sure, Alexander Campbell and such, definitely would have latched on to this in their criticism, and yet they don't. And I think that's telling, which I think tends to prove Smith was not saying this.
Right. And to show, once again, another piece, when Holland gives his talk against the Trinity, I think 2007, we've referred to it multiple times on this because it's such a clear place where we can come and see the different Jesus that we are worshiping. He, once again, centers it on the first vision, says he couldn't fall for the creeds,
right?
Because he saw this, rooted it in his
experience.
It goes,
but to see that concurs with what Hinckley said.
Right.
They all know. They all know that what Smith is claiming to see and what they think that will result in, the conclusion of this, is not at all what Christians have believed, ever. They know that.
Right.
And that's why they have to keep emphasizing this.
Absolutely.
And so,
the priesthood restoration, this one was, this is a biggie because, as you're well aware, just make sure the audience gets this, authority is going to dominate our conversations. Even in the context of we agree doctrinally, and there's kind of this weird decay, at least socially. If you push them on why be LDS, it's going to be priesthood authority and rooting it in the restoration of this authority. Take us through this, how we approach these sources in the same pattern of how we identify what happened versus the stories that are told.
Well, priesthood authority becomes everything in the LDS Church. That's what gives them the authority to baptize, to administer the sacrament, things like that. And of course, because we are on the outside, that we're a part of the Great Apostasy, we don't have that authority. Therefore, as I think it was even Orson Pratt who said that even our baptisms are illegitimate, our marriages are illegitimate.
Yep. They don't recognize any of them.
Yeah, right. God doesn't recognize those. So it becomes a pretty serious thing. The way they come up with this, the way Joseph Smith comes up with this, he's notorious for going to the Old Testament and finding things in the Old Testament and tries to squeeze it into some kind of a New Testament model here that we don't see in the early Christian church. Like they make a big deal over this Aaronic priesthood. Well, do you really think that Jesus didn't know the rules regarding the Aaronic priesthood or the Levitical priesthood as it's known? Of course he knew the rules. He knew that there were certain requirements that had to be met. And if you didn't meet those requirements, it was no question you weren't a legitimate priest. Of course, you had to be from the tribe of Levi. We know that. But just because you were from the tribe of Levi did not mean you were qualified to be a priest. In order to be a priest, you had to be a son of Aaron. You had to be related to Aaron. Smith knows this because he does talk about that a little bit in the Doctrine and Covenants. However, he has a loophole, but if you don't find a son of Aaron, then you can do this. Well, that's not what they thought in the Old Testament. And I'm sure Jesus wouldn't have thought that in the New. But yet this is typical Mormonism. But it's the priesthood that gives all authority. And you would think, if they're going to be consistent, that this authority that this priesthood gives precedes even God the Father becoming God, because Joseph Smith taught that God was once a man. And so, okay, when he was once a man, who was in charge? Well, there was a God before him. Well, did he have priesthood authority? Well, they would, of course, say yes. Of course he had priesthood authority. So if you keep tracing this lineage going into eternity past, there's always this priesthood authority. Now, the Bible doesn't support this. This is something that Joseph Smith makes up. And of course, because many Latter-day Saints naturally believe he's a prophet, they're just going to buy into whatever he tells them, which is dangerous. And I always caution Latter-day Saints, be careful about that. You're making an assumption that I don't think you've really proven yet. Because when you ask them, well, how do you know Joseph Smith was a prophet? It's either something like, well, I prayed about it. Okay, like nothing can go wrong there, right? Or it's because he brought forth the gold plates.
Yeah.
Well, how do you know the gold plates are significant? Because they were brought forth by a prophet. See, it's that circular reasoning that I don't think any of us would want to buy. But this priesthood authority becomes essential, and they are not of the sons of Aaron, so they're not qualified. And the Bible makes it very clear that even someone tried to be a priest and was not a son of Aaron. In a theocratic society that the Jews had in the Old Testament, that was the death penalty.
Yep.
That's how serious it was with God. And I've often said that I think what the LDS Church has done, they're all committing the sin of Jeroboam. And because Jeroboam in the northern tribes was ordaining anybody to the priesthood, and that's brought out very significantly in the Old Testament. And isn't that what the Mormons are doing? Okay, they may not be giving it to women, maybe yet, okay, but they certainly are not just they are not being significant in just giving it to those who are sons of Aaron. So they're violating Scripture. But
in the temple, women do exercise some form of it, even if they do say it's under the We've interviewed Jolene Phelps and Casey Cheney. And they discussed their experience going through the temple as women and how it differed from, say, my experience when I went through. But anyway, sorry.
No, I'm just saying that their view, even when it comes to the priesthood, cannot be justified from the Bible, and I just think it's very problematic. But yet, this is the big calling card that they think they have over us. Well, we have the authority, and you don't, But they seem to miss out those verses in the New Testament that says that when we put our trust in what Jesus has done for us, he gives us that authority. And we become sons and daughters of God through our faith in Christ. We are not all sons and daughters of God, which of course is a doctrine of Mormonism. They believe that we are the literal offspring of God and Heavenly Mother, first existing in the pre-existence, the spirit world, as spirit children who take on this mortality in order to prove ourselves worthy to get back into the presence of God. But certainly this is not something that Christians have ever believed. I don't know of any first century Christians believing like Mormons on this. And that's the irony of this whole movement. They think that they believe and practice like first century Christians believed and practiced. That's where they get this term restored. It's the restored gospel. It's a restored church. But to restore means to put back what was there originally. And when we ask, well, where do you find this being done originally? Well, there was this great apostasy, and all the evidence, has kind of like been expunged from existence. So they have no real evidence. And even Bible verses that they say support these teachings have been, these plain and precious things have been taken out of the Bible. But isn't it kind of strange that they all have their little pet verses?
Yep.
Though they interpret them pretty badly, they do think that those verses support what they believe. So, in essence, did those plain and precious things really get taken out? Because you're pointing to a Bible verse that's still there. It's just that you're interpreting it very badly.
Right.
And that, I think, is something that we need to sit down with our LDS friends and try to show them exegetically. This is not a good interpretation of that passage. You're reading something into, let's say, the writings of Paul that Paul never intended. And that's dangerous. And as Christians, we often caution fellow Christians, don't do that.
Right.
It's like that old line, where you hear of well-meaning Christians saying, well, what does that verse mean to you? I go, I don't care. I want to know what it meant to the person who wrote it. What are they saying? And they're trying to communicate to me. I'm not inserting my own personal views on this. I want to know what he meant by that.
Exactly.
So.
And even in the history of interpretation, it's just to see how have other Christians read this, and, how close are we to that? Not that they determine the meaning, but it is good to consult what others have said about these passages, just to see, what's the range of meaning Christians have, kind of inherited. But there's always that check on that, though, right? That the original in its context trumps all of that. Whereas, for them, it's almost by feeling in the moment.
Oh,
Sometimes.
Well, Mormonism is very feelings oriented.
Yeah, and it can change almost day to day.
It's all about how do you feel about this? I remember being down on Temple Square and listening to the sister missionaries, and then they would ask, well, how do you feel when you're standing here? Because it's sacred to them.
Right.
To me, it's just concrete, okay? But
right.
And I remember the first time I was asked that, and I was kind of thrown off, like, what are they asking me? What do you feel here? Well, I think the first time I came to Utah, it was in the summer. It was kind of hot, That's kind of what I'm feeling. But as I learned this, really what they're wanting to know, was there something I heard that just gave me an extra sense of warmth or something positive? And in their estimation, that kind of points to it being true. And you can see the danger behind that, because not all feelings that are true leave you with a good feeling. I mean, if you go to the doctor and they say you have cancer, you're not going to feel good about that.
Right.
Does that mean his diagnosis is any less accurate? Not necessarily. Maybe you want a second opinion, but if you've got cancer, you better listen, or you're going to shorten your lifespan. And whether it feels good to you or not.
Right.
And this is why this is not how we are to determine truth. But yet, I've had many Latter-day Saints, when I'm talking to them, they'll say things like, well, I don't feel the Spirit when you talk.
Yeah.
Why? I've been doing nothing but quoting the Book of Mormon. I've been quoting Joseph Smith, quoting your history. Why don't you feel good about that? I mean, it's your stuff.
Right.
It's like everything at the center that we have, that signage, it's all from their material. It's their material. And it might not make you feel good, but if it's true, should you not listen? It's kind of like getting a manila envelope from the IRS. Nobody feels good when they get one of those.
Yeah.
But you better pay attention.
Yeah, don't ignore it.
Don't ignore it.
Please. We're not giving financial advice
Right.
here on the pod, but don't ignore that letter. It is interesting because they're making objective truth claims, but it's on this foundation of hedonism, feels good is good. And just another point, the fact that Holocaust happened, and it did happen, that doesn't make me feel good.
No.
But we ignore it at our own peril. What is possible, and even in a modern, advanced, educated society, can change really quickly. And so, absolutely. You need a check on that, absolutely. And for us, it is the Word of God. The one thing that strikes me, too, is even in their own narrative, their emphasis on Aaronic and Melchizedek. And we've had Matt Amati on to discuss his book on who Melchizedek really was. I would recommend, this is new to the listener, to go back and listen to that.
Matt loves the Old Testament.
He's great. Yeah, he's a great brother. In fact, I gave him homework. He's coming on again soon.
Oh, good.
But Peter, James, and John didn't hold the Aaronic either. right? So they have to say they restored to Melchizedek, but if the Aaronic in their system is like, the military, E1 to E9, and you move up into the Melchizedek, they never held the Aaronic.
Yeah. No, they didn't.
So, yeah, I mean, it's just, it doesn't work if you take a second to think about it, get past the feelings, and just think, does that make sense?
Well, Mormonism places such an emphasis on this whole priesthood idea to the point that you have to ask yourself, if it's that important, why is it we don't see it in the New Testament?
Right.
Why is it Jesus never talks about this? Why don't we see a structure like the LDS Church has today regarding the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood? We don't see that.
Right.
And then when we get into Hebrews, we find out the only one that really qualifies for anything close to a quote-unquote Melchizedek priesthood, and it doesn't even say that. He was a priest after the order of Melchizedek, and of course the writer's making a comparison to the figure that was in the Old Testament. Only Jesus qualifies.
Right.
And the writer spells out why he's the only one that qualifies. If a Latter-day Saint were to seriously look at those verses, you would think they would stop and go, wait a minute, how can I have this? Because I don't meet those requirements. I don't have an endless life. I'm not sinless. I don't do any of this kind of stuff. But yet, I guess, Skylar, it's because they just don't place the same emphasis on the Bible as we do.
No, it is not a text-based religion.
No, it's not.
And that's something that Christians can struggle with in terms of giving it more credit than it deserves, is they claim the standard works are their standard. No, it doesn't function as a standard, regardless of what they say. Even, the Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists are disagreements on some of these passages on secondary doctrine. It is a text-based debate. It's not, I feel this, so you're wrong. It's based on what do these passages actually mean.
Yeah, you're right.
That's a text-based debate.
Yes.
For the LDS, it's often, what is it? Experience-based. It's more romantic. Mm-hmm. I would say irrational, not in the sense like it classically conceived that there actually was a movement in intellectual history called irrationalism, where faith became against reason, and it was even virtuous to go against what made sense as kind of a reaction to the rationalism. This is their standard, and they will use the Bible insofar as they can make it agree. Once they've done something with it.
Yeah, they have their pet proof text.
Exactly.
Like 1 Corinthians 15 and baptism for the dead, things like that. Naturally, all groups have their little pet proof text. I would say as Christians we do, but we better be careful that we're using those texts properly.
Right.
And we aren't doing the same thing that they're doing, lifting them out of their context in order for it to support what we want to believe. We have to be careful of that too.
Absolutely. And that's why our commitment to sola scriptura and the method of how you responsibly treat a text functions as a check against excesses, against where we can go wrong. There is a built-in check. Mm-hmm. With LDS, there isn't. The check is basically what the leaders say that enough people listen to. And so there's this center of gravity between what's coming down in the personal revelation variable and up. And so, this kind of unstable middle is what we can say is official at any point in time. And I hope the listener can hear it. I'm trying to accurately describe it. But anyway, there's so many threads on this priesthood restoration, but I hope they can hear once again that this is, if you look at the Bible as a whole in context, what's being restored doesn't resemble it.
Correct.
And then, maybe we can come back to this sometime, but if you look carefully at when this story becomes important in Mormon history, some of the earliest even witnesses of the Book of Mormon had never heard the story of it being restored through John, and this is something, of course, like a lot of things, the Tanners first discovered by comparing the earliest edition of the Doctrine and Covenants with later.
Yeah, even the story of Peter, James, and John showing up, doesn't it seem a little curious that there's no date?
Right.
Something like that, and you don't remember. You and Oliver Cowdery both don't remember when that happened. Wow, that seems to be a momentous occasion, and you have to guess as to when it happened. And you have to kind of squeeze it in here because, again, you've got a timeline you've got to be true to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I agree with Grant Palmer that it fit when they needed it. They needed the charismatic stuff was kind of eating itself, and Joseph needed a way to set him and at that time Oliver Cowdery apart. So they remember the story back into history to say, yeah, this is why we're the guys and you're not,
Yeah.
right? So the Book of Mormon itself, this is one that the more I think about it, the more I think if it's not the first vision, the Book of Mormon and the historicity of the Book of Mormon is so devastating to Mormon truth claims. And I know you, once again, you've done a lot of work in comparison with the Bible because you, as you know, those in treat them similar with a kind of superstitious view. And then when people leave, they often turn the critical eye on both, and they still fail to distinguish between the Bible and the Book of Mormon in the post-Mormon world. And they treat them both as made up, as if Reformed Egyptian, a language that doesn't exist, is on the same level as a Hebrew that does. As if a Zarahemla that we have no idea where it is comparable to a Jerusalem we do. So there's a similar kind of, for lack of a better word, fundamentalism. There might be a better word than that, but within the Mormon community and the post-Mormon community on this. So do you want to take us through the Book of Mormon itself, what it claims to be, and did it happen?
Well, it's supposed to be a record, as the angel tells Joseph Smith, supposedly, of ancient inhabitants on this continent. And of course, where is this continent? Is it the North American continent, meaning the United States area? Is it Central America? Is it South America? The church has never been clear, except to say they have no geography for the Book of Mormon. They say that on their website right now. We don't have a geography for this, and if you have a theory, don't say we support you, because the church leadership will not support you. That, I think, should be fundamentally problematic for most people, because one of the things that we like to emphasize here at the center is that we believe the Bible to be a book of real people, real places, and real events. But the Latter-day Saint cannot say that about the Book of Mormon. They can believe it, but they don't have evidence to support it. And I think the church, by that comment that's currently on their website, tends to undermine anyone who thinks that there are certain areas that could be Book of Mormon lands. But you're right, it's very important. In fact, the first vision and the Book of Mormon are really two of the most important fundamentals of the LDS faith. And as Gordon B. Hinckley said, if you get rid of the first vision and God the Father speaking to Joseph, then our church isn't true. It was Jeffrey Holland who made a very similar statement regarding the Book of Mormon, that if it's not true, the church isn't true. You have to take it the way Joseph Smith tells the story. And as we've talked about earlier, that's exactly how I try to approach this. I want to know how they tell the story. How did Smith tell the story? And if you take away that, and I've often told people, if you could convince a Latter-day Saint that the Book of Mormon is not true, or that the first vision is not true, they're probably going to leave the church. Maybe not physically, and I mean that, because many members don't believe it, but they haven't left the church for a number of reasons.
Right, social
reasons. Family, and it's tough when you're married to an LDS spouse who takes this very seriously, especially in Mormonism, when salvation is a team effort. It's got to be husband and wife. And if one of the team members quits, you need to get a replacement, because that's just how it works.
Yep, that happened with my parents.
Yeah. And so this is why if I'm going to deal with the historical aspects of Mormonism, I like to deal with either the Book of Mormon or the First Vision, because their leaders have said it is that important. So if they say that, maybe that's where we should go in. We talked about polygamy earlier, and yeah, that's an important subject. And I think there's a lot of complications that comes with polygamy and some of the claims that Joseph Smith made for polygamy as far as being a command and things like that. You don't find that in the Bible. But that is something to talk about, but it's probably not something I would bring up right away unless they brought it up. And I'm willing to go with them on that, but they don't normally bring that subject up.
No,
I think they even know that's kind of a difficult subject to defend. But Book of Mormon, First Vision, absolutely. If you're going to deal with historical aspects, those are the two subjects. We probably should have the facts behind us to talk to them in an intelligent manner.
I find it very telling that they have yet to have a gospel topics essay on the historicity of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, you could read that a couple of different ways, but I think they know this is devastating. And so I loved how you started your presentation a few weeks ago with a tour guide for the Holy Land, for Israel, with biblical sites, including some not seen as that significant, and then, of course, the major ones. And then you showed the competing equivalent for the different views of the Book of Mormon and how radically different is Cumorah in New York or Mexico. I mean, that's
Right.
we're not talking like within Israel, like where's that that Bethany beyond the Jordan,
Right.
where I mean, there's only a narrow range where it could be. We haven't yet precisely found it, but clearly John recognizes the difference and that it's a particular place in his embeddedness.
Yeah, there was even a church built there where they think it was.
Wow.
At Bethany Beyond Jordan. I've been there, and it's amazing. Of course, the Jordan at the time I was there is just a little trickle,
Yeah,
and it's
right.
not at all probably what it was like back then. But you're right. When they advertise, for instance, Book of Mormon land tours, and there are companies around here that do have those tours, it all depends on the particular worldview of who's putting on the tour, whether you're going to go to New York, okay, or, Cumorah, being up in New York, or going down to Central America if they held to the limited geography theory. And I don't find a lot of Latter-day Saints, though, really holding on to the hemispheric model. I know Joseph Smith kind of toyed with that, it seems like, towards the end of his life. But for the most part, I find most Latter-day Saints think that they're either in the United States area, Ohio Valley area, of course, Cumorah in New York, or they're holding to more of a limited geography theory down in Guatemala and southern Mexico and places like that. Because I've heard some of these guys talk about, well, see those pyramids down there? Well, those are actually remnants of the Book of Mormon people. Okay. And they firmly believe it. And I do want to respect it as far as that is a belief they have. I don't share it, and I think I can show why. But these people are very sincere in this. So this is why I would caution Christians, using a mocking tone when they're talking with Latter-day Saints about anything like this, because they do take it very seriously. And I often ask Christians, if someone were to reverse this, and let's say an atheist was treating us in a mocking, joking manner, being obnoxious, we probably wouldn't like it. And I don't see why we need to do that. I think we can have intelligent conversations and discuss real facts like adults. And I try to do that. And I think we should. I think it's honoring to God to do it with gentleness and respect. We try to do that on our radio show. I know some Latter-day Saints, if they do listen to us, sometimes wonder if we might cross that boundary. And I hope they're not mistaking being firm with trying to be flippant, because we're not. But sometimes you have to say things that are going to be hard-hitting. And if you really firmly believe in something just the opposite, that's going to cause you some emotional feelings. But I hope Latter-day Saints don't see us as being mocking or anything like that. We do go after, for instance, the leaders of the church.
For sure.
We kind of notch it up when it comes to the leaders and some of their scholars. But for the lay people, we have the utmost sympathy for them because they are the victims of this. Mm-hmm. And we firmly believe that they are victims of this deception. And we are hoping to reach those people. And of course, if we are going to be obnoxious and arrogant towards them, treat them badly, they're not going to listen to us any more than I would want to listen to a Latter-day Saint that treats me like that.
Absolutely. What are some of the biggest points that point away from the Book of Mormon having ever happened, that there were ever Nephites and Lamanites?
I think one of the things, for me at least, that is a huge difference between the Bible and the Book of Mormon is I love archaeology. Mm-hmm. And I get so excited when I find out about all the things that they have found that verify biblical stories. I mean, I could spend hours in the Israel Museum. I know that because I have, just reading every sign, and yet when you go downtown, Salt Lake City, just go in their history museum and say, okay, where do you keep your Nephite artifacts?
Right.
I've done that, and they have none. There are no Nephite artifacts. And I often tell the story of when Eric and I went down there years ago. This is when we were both still living in California. And we went into the history museum, and I went up to one of the ladies, very nice lady, and said, we're from out of town. We're very fascinated with your faith. Where do you keep on display your Nephite artifacts? And she had this look on her face, and I often describe it as a look of, we should have those, why don't we? And so she went over, and there was a man talking to some people not far from where we were standing, and went up to him and was talking to him, and he looked over and acknowledged us. He excused himself, came over to talk to us, and we repeated our question. From out of town, we're just wondering, where do you keep your Nephite artifacts? And he kind of shook his head and said, there are no Nephite artifacts. He says, the church doesn't even know where to dig. That's what he told us. Now, we didn't know it at the time, but I found out later on we were talking to the church curator. I mean, the museum curator. He's the head of this place at that time. And he's admitting that to us, that they have no artifacts like that. Now, you would think, when the Book of Mormon describes these people groups as numbering in the millions, that there should be some kind of evidence, because that's what archaeology is. It's a civilization's junk that they leave behind,
right.
And there's no junk left behind these people. It just seems very odd to me, and that's why I'm so fascinated with the Bible, because it even lends credence to all the stories that make the people in the Bible look bad. It's not airbrushed. It's just not. And it just fascinates me even to this day, at how much they are finding. And I know a Mormon would say, well, they haven't found everything. Well, no, and I'm not expecting them to find everything, nor do I. Is that a deal breaker for me?
Right.
They have certainly found enough, for me personally, that gives some historical validity to what the Bible says. Mm-hmm. And yet, the Book of Mormon's still batting zero.
Exactly. That's the key. We're not asking for everything to be verified. We're asking for anything to be verified. That language being there and the remnants of the Native Americans that they used to say were the Nephites were the principal ancestors of. A place that matches the language form, a written language where it should be. And the Mayans don't count, because we know a lot about the Mayans.
We do.
And they're not Christians. They're not debating baptism, age of baptism. That's what people around Joseph Smith at the time he wrote the Book of Mormon are debating. And chickens aren't there, Sandra loves to point out, right? Sandra loves to point out that the animals don't match. The agriculture practice doesn't match.
Right.
So you have to make it as bare bone as a road system, or whether there was mining. Well, a lot of people have road systems and drink water and sleep. Right. That's not evident. If it could fit any people group, that's not we need particulars. And Joseph Smith gave an entire book of particulars. Yeah. And there's nothing. One thing that stands out to me is, of course, we live at a time of massive skepticism toward the Bible. And yet, and you've been there, I haven't. Non-believing archaeologists acknowledge these places, that language, that Jesus existed.
Yes.
These things that no non-LDS actual scholar of any Native American group, any, not all, any, from Alaska to the southern coast of Chile, uses the Book of Mormon as a source. None.
Yeah.
It is, and this is jarring. I mean, I came out of this. This is jarring to someone who used to believe it and imagine this as the history of the Native Americans and look for the time, the prophecies of the Book of Mormon, that the Native Americans would be massive conversion and that they were really Israelite and that they used to be white. I said that out loud. Yeah. Horribly racist as well. This is just, it's tragic, as you said. It's hard for me to have that tone always because I have my own problem coming out of this. But when I could see that and to say, the only people that believe this is history are those who have a blind faith in it because of Joseph Smith, whose credibility is at least questionable. Yeah. And it's devastating. It's devastating. And so this is another example of rewriting history and promoting that. unfortunately. So there's a contingent of people who are LDS that think this is their history, and it's a fake one. And it's
Imagine
very
how many
sad.
converts the church has had from missionaries sent to Central America telling them,
Yeah,
you're the people mentioned in the Book of
right,
Mormon. What a selling point that probably was for many of those converts.
right,
And then they find out, not so much.
right.
What happens to those people? What have you done to those people? And this is why I think why we see a lot of people coming out of the LDS church really not wanting anything to do with any religious faith at all, much less Christianity. It's because I already got burned, okay? You know, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And this is why they're very reluctant to put their trust in anything else. That is a stumbling block here in Utah because we do come across a lot of those people. And I know because I've talked to them. And it's funny how that, well, they've gone off into atheism. And I remember having a conversation with one of these guys says, well, how much time did you spend looking at the claims for atheism? And it ends up probably about as much time as he did for the claims of Mormonism. So you just
Right.
jump from one to another, and you really don't know what you're getting involved in as far as a worldview. It just seems to satisfy you at this point in time in your life. And but one question I often ask ex-Mormon atheists is, when you were a Latter-day Saint, did you believe Jesus rose from the dead bodily? And they'll say, well, yeah. I said, okay, well, what evidence did you find since then to disprove that for you? I mean, it kind of all kind of hinges on that, doesn't it? And of course, they never bothered to even check into it. They just don't believe Mormonism, and they're going to just chuck everything. And I think that what this proves to me, at least, is it shows me that that Jesus, whatever view they had of Jesus as a member, really was not the foundation of their faith. It never was the foundation. And I think this proves it because the church was the foundation. Whatever view they had of Jesus was on top of that foundation. But when the foundation, the church, was crushed and demolished, everything built on top of that went with it. And I think that's what you're explaining there. They just throw out everything. And that's so tragic.
It is.
And what's sad is a lot of these people, they don't know the names that we know as far as biblical scholars who could help them with a lot of the questions they probably have and maybe don't even know how to formulate. They don't know their names. And this is one thing that we're trying to do is point people in those directions. That's why at the center here, we talk a lot about biblical apologetics. We talk about archaeology, how our Bible came to be. And we've got the books here. And if somebody's got some serious questions, these will help them. And they will
Absolutely.
point them in the right direction. And that's what we're hoping to do.
Absolutely. As we head toward a conclusion, you know, we could name names, people who are otherwise great when it comes to Mormon studies, largely, who would say we as Christians are using a double standard, right? Who would say, well, look, there's higher critics of the Bible. You know, if by the same standard, we would come to a different conclusion about the religion that we're a part of. What would you say to someone that says that?
Well, when it comes to the issue of having to, let's say, take something by faith, to believe in something that has not been proven, that's faith. I think the problem for Latter-day Saints, though, is they're believing in things that have been disproven.
Yeah.
And that's not faith. That's foolish. And I think we need to kind of guide our LDS friends into seeing that's how we view them. We think the things that you are believing in have been disproven, and this is why. And all we're asking for is a bit of an audience here to listen to why we're struggling with some of the truth claims that you have. There are definitely things that we have to take by faith, and there are differences of opinions. Naturally, these scholars come from different worldviews. My question is, I don't know the hearts of many of these people. Is it just no matter what evidence you gave them, they're still not going to believe it anyway? And I've talked to atheists like that. It doesn't matter what you show me, I still am not going to believe in God. I said, okay, so it's more of a volitional thing, not really an evidential thing.
Right.
And I think that's important to understand there. But I would say Christianity is more of a reasonable faith. There's reasons why we believe the things we do. But there's one thing when it comes to the Bible that I took away. I was reading this book, and we carry it here at the center. That's Scribes and Scriptures, I think is the name.
Oh, it's a great book.
Yeah, the ending I thought was amazing, and it was so encapsulated in something that was very, very, very profound, because after they go through in this entire book being totally honest on all the warts when it comes to our modern Bibles and all the texts, and it's not like God drops a King James Bible out of heaven complete with red letters. No, it's not like that at all. But Christians shouldn't be afraid of that.
No.
I think reading a book like that is very helpful. But what they did was, after showing all the difficulties, they asked the question, so you may ask, why would we as scholars believe the Bible in light of all this evidence that we've just talked about and responded to? And I thought the classic answer was because Jesus believed it. Jesus quoted it. Jesus respected it. And when you think about it, if Jesus was who he claimed to be, he is God in the flesh, who cannot lie, who knows all things, and yet he's quoting the Old Testament. Why shouldn't we trust it? And as a believer, as a Christian, that's profound to me, because I don't believe my Jesus can mess up in that area.
Right.
I don't think you can mess up in any area, but
Right.
certainly not when it comes to the text.
Right. And hopefully the categorical differences that we just mentioned will help people at least say, this is something, people have attacked the Bible because it's worth attacking. Well, what did Bart Ehrman do with the Book of Mormon?
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at what he does to a Gospel of John, we've had Lydia McGrew on talking about the historical reliability of the Gospel of John. Recommend her book. There's tons of evidence that John has times, places, right, things right that have been verified, that match other texts that he probably wasn't aware of, matches the Samaritan controversy we learn about later from a Josephus, things like this, or simultaneous. That there's nothing like that for things like the Book of Mormon, and so many of the other things rest on the trust of a man we know lied. We know Joseph Smith lied.
Yeah, that's true.
You could say, he's lying for some higher purpose or whatever. That's what an LDS apologist has to do. But even they have to say he lied.
Yeah.
And we are not doing that. We're talking about, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 lays out the faith, the gospel, and mentions 500 people that saw these things, many of whom have not died yet.
Right.
So we are talking about people that witness these things in a public, accountable way, not just a mass hallucination, not just one person's experience, a whole group who are loyal to the scriptures and believe they're going to be judged by God one day for their conduct. And they believe that Jesus is God, right? And so this is very different. The language exists. Koine Greek is a real language. Reformed Egyptian doesn't exist. Real texts that come from an embeddedness in time and space. If you believe the Moroni story with plates and all these, very different. So if you reject Mormonism and Christianity, you're rejecting two different things. That's what I want. We can't change hearts. I know we agree on that.
We can't.
But if you reject Christianity, you're rejecting something different. And that is an important thing. We need to show how it's distinct. And that's why we have Distinctive Christianity as the podcast name. If you do, just know you're not, these are not two flavors of the same, yogurt, This is something completely different. And you should take seriously the claims of Christianity.
Let me just add this. When many Latter-day Saints come out of Mormonism, they want to get rid of everything, including the possibility that what we claim in our churches is true. But doesn't that notion come from the same source that you can't trust?
Right.
So why are you trusting that truth claim, that all the churches are wrong and their Christianity is false? Why don't you take the time to at least listen to what Christians have taught on this?
Yeah.
And again, I might caution you that the best source might not be your neighbor. Okay? I'm going to be honest.
Right.
Sometimes as Christians, we're not very good at articulating what we really believe. Just ask most Christians to define the Trinity for you.
Right,
Oh, it's
right.
shameful.
It's a problem.
Shameful. It
Yeah.
is a problem. It doesn't make the doctrine any less true. It just
No.
means that there's far too many Christians that are not good at explaining it. But still, take the time. There's plenty of introductory books when it comes to what Christianity is all about. At least give it a fair shake. Give it an opportunity to explain itself to you. And that's about all I can tell you to do. I mean, I'm not the Holy Spirit. I often say I'm in sales, not production, right? I'm just here to tell the message, point you in the right direction. The Holy Spirit's going to do that work, but at least give it a fair shake.
Right. And I like to point out that on this podcast, we've had Methodists, we've had Presbyterians, we've had Baptists. And you know what they all agree on are these essential claims that set us apart from the claims of who we say is a false prophet, Joseph Smith. Are there any final words you have for our audience?
No, I think we covered quite a bit.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Bill, for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.